Thanks very much, Idoya. That was great, and you are doing very important work, and we all are, as citizens of the world, we're grateful for it, so thank you. I've been asked to talk a little bit about innovation at Amazon, how we think about it, how we go about it. But in fact, Daniel probably should be here to tell me how unhealthy this is, but I won't open it yet. I want to start by saying, though, I've worked for a lot of large organizations, large enterprises. One is Intel Corporation, the chip maker. But I've also worked for the United States Department of Commerce. I've spent a lot of time in Geneva working with the United Nations subgroup, the International Telecommunication Union. I spent some time at the National Aeronautics and Space Administration, the U.S. Space Agency. And then most recently was Chief of Staff to a commissioner of the Federal Communications Commission. So a lot of public sector experience. So I think I can appreciate, and I certainly am grateful for all the service that you provide the citizens of our different countries and of the world. You face challenges that Amazon does not face. You have constraints that Amazon does not have. And so I understand, I completely do, and I'm very grateful for your interest in trying to apply technology to your jobs, to your roles on the behalf of citizens of the world. And we'll talk a little bit about that. Now, so these are large organizations that I've worked for, but I've only worked for one startup, exactly one startup, and that's Amazon. When I joined Amazon 19 years ago, we very much were in startup mode company-wide. It was not profitable for several years afterwards. My mom really wondered what I was doing, going to work for a company that made no money. And obviously, over the past 19 years or so, the scope and scale of the company have changed. But I will tell you that internally to the company, the way we think about things, the way we go about our business, and the way that we innovate has not changed dramatically. It's changed barely. We still think of ourselves as a startup, a startup with 500,000 employees. It just happens to be larger, but it isn't different qualitatively. And so the way we maintain the startup culture internal to Amazon is not accidental. It's very purposeful. We do things very deliberately. And so it might be thought that this is just a process-based company. And to a certain extent, we do like process. We're techies. We're nerds. I'm an electrical engineer turned lawyer. As an electrical engineer, and including the boss, Jeff, is an electrical engineer, we do think technically, and we do think about process, but that doesn't limit our creativity if the process encourages creativity. And so in the context of innovation, that creativity comes through a process, but it's driven by a passion, and the passion is this: the service of our customers. We obsess over our customers, and I will tell you that 19 years ago, this month, when I went out to Seattle to interview at Amazon, I wondered to myself whether the professed customer obsession was one of more driven by marketing than actual functionality. It's not true. Internally to the company, it is the goal. It is the focus. Now, on our websites, you can check it out yourselves. There are what we call our leadership principles. These are the tenets by which we, as this organization, Amazon, operate. They govern how we hire people, how we evaluate people, and also how we make decisions internally. There are 14 of these leadership principles. I think if given the time, I probably could recite them all. But the number one, the principle one of the 14 is always customer obsession. And in your case, as public sector servants, you are serving a different kind of a customer, that is the citizen. So our customers are obviously your citizen customers. And in fact, of course, you have every citizen customer in the world. Government officials, public sector officials have this enormous responsibility of serving humans as customers. We have a subset. Maybe someday we'll have a substantial subset of citizens as Amazon customers, but governments currently have all citizens as customers. Well, the manifestation internally of customer obsession, I think principally as a process, derives from what we call the working backwards process. And the idea is this: if today we have an idea for a new product or service that we want to offer our customers, in your case, citizens, today we'll actually write a press release designed to be released with the new product or service 2 months from now, 6 months from now, 2 years, 5 years from now. But today, we'll write it. Well, what does this do for you? First of all, by writing it down, you've committed yourself. You're holding yourself accountable because, how many times have we made a decision to do something and then it turns out a couple months later it was a little bit hard and, well, did we really mean that? Let's do something else that's easier. No. By writing it down, you're committing yourself to seeing this through and actually delivering that press release in the product or service that it's announcing. The second thing it does for you is it's written in customer terms. What's in it for her? It's not all the hard things that we need to do to figure out how to build or design something. It's not that. It's what does she get out of it? What does she care about? It's written in customer language, and therefore that means that how we get to the point of the what, how we deliver that product or service to a customer is a lot less important that we do it. We actually deliver the what, the product or service. And the third thing it does for you by writing out this press release in advance is a little bit more sublime, but here's the idea. If you write a press release today and you know you're not going to send it out for many months or maybe years in the future, you're writing it today, you're admitting to yourself that today it's impossible. Because if it were possible today, you'd write the release and send it out in the morning or next week. But it's not possible if you're writing it today and you're saying we'll send this out in several years. And that means we admit freely that we can't do it now, and that we have to invent stuff. We have to innovate in a way that allows us to eventually deliver that product or service. So it's a humbling thing to write one of these press releases. I've done it several times in my career. And when you do it, it can be daunting. You're basically saying, gosh, I have to invent stuff. There's impossible things that I need to somehow overcome. So that's scary. But the cool thing, though, is it gives you that goal. That goal is there, and you're going to figure out how to invent your way to that new product or service. One of the more interesting ones that I've been involved with is a product or service that has not yet been released, and the simple reason is because it's still in development, but you may have heard of it. This is a future drone delivery service called Amazon Prime Air, and I was part of the team that, it was like a team of 5 or 6 people who wrote this press release a few years ago. And the core of the press release is customer can receive a product within 30 minutes of placing an order. That's it. I mean, there's a little bit more detail in what we wrote, but that's the nub of it. It's not even very interesting, except that we know that this is a real customer need. We get the fact that our customers have to make buying choices sometimes, and delivery speed is important. Say your granddaughter is visiting, and she's on the floor with you, and she's got a little electric truck that she's running around, and you're playing with her, and the batteries die, and you don't have any more batteries. Well, what are your choices? If you place an order online, hopefully you can get it sometime that day. That's the best case scenario. But more likely you think, well, why don't I get into the automobile and drive to a store? But then you've had to put the code on her. You've got to get her dressed all up, and you put her in the car, and you drive to the store. The moment is lost. That moment in time that you were playing with your granddaughter on the floor is gone. And you've got your batteries now, but kind of so what? Maybe the next time she visits, you can try it again. But why not just simply place an order and say, I need batteries quick, and a drone delivers it in 14, 15 minutes. The moment's not lost. You never had to bundle her up, take her out, go through all that inconvenience, and there are the batteries. And so that was the customer need that we were facing. And it turns out that doing that on the surface of Earth is really hard. And here in Madrid, something about traffic. It is true that even sort of bicycle messengers or motorcycle delivery, it's just not reliable under 30 minutes. But unmanned aerial vehicles, aerial drones, are. And so we set out that goal of the delivery within 30 minutes of an order, and then how we do it, well, it turns out that's really, really hard to do. And so When I joined Amazon 19 years ago, I had no idea that we would be sitting around designing propellers, but we are. We're actually designing propellers. Who knew? The reason why, by the way, is because if you've ever been in a propeller airplane, you know that the propellers are sort of oriented horizontally, and you fly like this through the air. Well, every time you're flying through the air, this is undisturbed air. It's not turbulence, then the propeller is going through undisturbed air. But in contrast, a vertical takeoff and landing device like a drone using propellers is almost by definition always in turbulent air because it's creating the turbulence and that's where the propellers are. So it makes them loud. Designing a quiet propeller has never been a real goal of engineers because there are so few helicopters, for example, and they're big things and they fly very high. But designing drones that are quiet is a major goal of ours, and so we have people designing propellers. There's all sorts of other things going into things like more efficient batteries, more intelligent systems. In fact, as it turns out, with drone deliveries, getting from a warehouse with that package of batteries to your apartment complex or your home, whatever, is fairly easy. Navigating is easy. The challenges involve things like avoiding obstacles like trees and buildings. You don't want to run into those things. And those are actually fairly easy to map out and to be aware of in a system. But geese, for example, birds, are not in a system. You don't know where they are. They don't tell you where they're going. They're not electronic at all, and so you still have to be able to see them and avoid them. It turns out to be very difficult to do. And then when you go to, when you get to a customer's location, you have to figure out what to do, and it's not you that's figuring it out. It's not you, a human being. It's the drone itself. It has to be entirely autonomous. And so when it gets to a delivery point, it has to assess what's going on the ground below it and figure out where and how to land, or whether to land even. So if there's sort of movement that's detectable by sensors, movement's easy to detect, right? By any sensor can do that. But determining what that movement is a big question. If it just happens to be a bush that's kind of gently swaying in the breeze, that's fine, land next to it. If it's a dog that's running around barking, ready to attack the drone when it lands, that's a different thing. So the drone has to be smart enough to figure out what's there on the ground. And again, it has to do it autonomously. This involves a lot of machine learning, artificial intelligence, sensor fusion, all these buzz tech words. But let me cut this close and short, that those details don't matter to me as grandfather. The detail that matters as grandfather is, did the batteries get to me in 30 minutes or less? That's the detail. We need to figure out what goes on in between to make that possible. So that's what we call working backwards. You set that goal for a customer, for a citizen, and then you work backwards to today to figure out all the things that you need to take care of it. All right. That's customer obsession. Another component of innovation at Amazon is vitally important, and this is, I understand this is a hard thing for government. I get it. It's experimentation, and it's experimentation with a willingness to fail. Amazon has failed many times, many times over the years. In fact, Jeff says that he's personally responsible for billions of dollars of failure, and that's easily believable. We've spent a lot of time and effort on things that did not work. But here's why. To innovate, to do something new, to do actually something that's never been done before, that's what innovate means, you must experiment. And the reason why is an experiment is necessary to show whether an innovation fails. By the way, an experiment can never prove something to be right, including a scientific theory. So, in his 100 years plus of fame, Einstein has never, ever been proven right. He can't be. A scientific theory cannot be proven right. People have failed repeatedly to prove him wrong, and therefore we have a high level of confidence in what he proposed and postulated. It has some basis in reality, but you can't prove it right. Likewise with any experiment. If you go into an experiment, you can't say that this is going to be the outcome, but it must be able to fail, or else it's not an experiment. For those of you who had, say, a high school chemistry or physics class, undoubtedly you did experiments, right? You went to a laboratory, and in chemistry you might have mixed some chemicals together and heated them up and so forth, and it did something. It turned blue. your teacher knew that it was supposed to turn blue. Maybe even you knew it was supposed to turn blue and you were glad that it did. But that's not an experiment. Even though it was called an experiment, it's not. It's really just a demonstration of something that had been done decades, if not centuries earlier. That's not an experiment. A true experiment is when you go into it, you do something, and you really don't know how it's going to turn out. You might have some predictions, some ideas. Hopefully it won't blow up and those sorts of things. But at the same time, you don't know how it's going to turn out. And therefore, an experiment must have the possibility of failure, or it's not an experiment. Likewise, innovation. To innovate, you must experiment, therefore you must be willing to fail. This is hard for large enterprises, including government institutions, to deal with. No one likes to fail, but we have a leadership principle, against which we are evaluated, each of us as individuals at Amazon, which is called our right, comma, a lot. Our right, a lot. And of course, it's a good thing to be right. No one likes to be wrong. Sometimes it's embarrassing to be wrong. But in the context of experimentation, it doesn't say our right. It doesn't say our right all the time, certainly. It says our right a lot. That means you can be wrong a lot in the context of experimentation. If you're trying new things, you must be able to fail. And if you're never wrong, you're either exceedingly lucky, or you're really not experimenting. You're doing something else. And so I encourage you all in your roles to consider how, when you want to innovate, how would you experiment? How would you go about doing the experiment? And how would you accept the failure of it? How would you tell your boss or tell your citizens that it failed? This was when we attempted to do something, we tried it and it didn't work. One way to avoid that being catastrophic is to continuously experiment, continuously innovate. Don't just wait until you must. This is a problem that happens to a lot of companies, and that is that they have a good product or service or a great idea that they've been relying on for years, if not decades, and they continue to rely on it, and their customers are happy and they have a good business. And then suddenly something happens, a new technology is introduced, or a new entrant has a better idea, and the first company, the old line companies, its business is in jeopardy. And so suddenly they must innovate to survive. Quick, let's innovate, we got to do it. Well, if you're in that position, you're betting your company. Because if you fail in that particular experiment, you may be done. That may be the end of your company entirely. So Amazon will always make big bets. We'll always continue to experiment and try things that are very expensive, including Jeff's billions of dollars of failures. But we'll never bet the company. And the way that this can be avoided, you may say this is sort of a zero-sum game. You go into some experiments and maybe 3 out of 4 fail at some level. Maybe it's 9 out of 10 fail. How can that be sustainable if you're failing more often than you're succeeding? Well, the reason is quite simple. It's that, unlike sports, business has no cap on success. So say Real Madrid had a match in a local pitch here against some 5- and 6-year-old boys. Who's going to win the match? Well, Real Madrid's going to win. And it's going to be, 51-0, 75-0, something like that. But what does Real Madrid get out of that? 1 win. No matter how well they won, they got 1 win. That's not true in business at all, nor is it true in government. If you succeed at something in a big way, you can get 10 wins, 100 wins, 10,000 wins, right? And that will pay for a lot of losses. So because success is not capped in any large enterprise, frankly in any startup, the wins, few may they be, are going to greatly outweigh the losses. So in that context of accepting failure and in experimenting and innovating, we also have a decision-making process. We're not doing things randomly. We have to actually decide what kinds of resources we want to allocate. In fact, it turns out that one of our most scarce resources is software development engineers. If we're assigning a really talented software development engineer over here, she's not available for the project over here. So she's on this one, and we're making a very conscious decision that she's going to put her talents into this and not that. That's a choice. That's a decision that we've had to make. So how do we make these kinds of decisions internally? Well, it turns out that the internal decision-making process from the mid-levels of the company all the way up to the top involving Jeff are ones that are based on narrative descriptions, narrative discussions, narrative proposals. We don't allow decision-making to be based on music, or on bullet point presentations, because bullet points just simply aren't precise enough. So anytime a proponent has a new idea, an experiment to try, that proponent is required to write what we call a 6-page narrative. This is a prose narrative, complete sentences, paragraphs, the whole thing. It can be no longer than 6 pages long, and it has to describe the proposal and what the thinking was that went into it. Well, it turns out that the exercise of writing a prose narrative really forces the proponent of an idea to think in a way that bullet points don't. A bullet point can be very vague. First-to-market strategy. What does that mean? I mean, that can be defined as meaning like 75 different things. Does it mean that we should have one? Does it mean that the competitors do? Does it mean that we already got one? Who knows? But if you write it in a paragraph, using complete sentences, you have to explain yourself. So the way this goes down, the way the decision is made is that the people who are empowered to make the decision, again, all the way up to the top, will meet with the proponent of an idea. And we schedule an hour-long meeting, and for the first hour of the meeting, absolute silence. People are just reading the document, reading that narrative. So you say, wait, that's half an hour of all these decision makers' time is wasted. No, what it does is it ensures that everyone has read the document, everyone has read it completely, and everyone has read it recently enough that we can have an intelligent conversation about it. How many times have we gone to a meeting when you've actually read the homework and somebody else hasn't? They haven't looked at it. Or they looked at it 3 weeks ago. They said they were really eager to do it, and they looked at it 3 weeks ago and they forget, or they read it on the subway on the way to the office. All those, the people have different levels of information when they're in that meeting. By forcing people to read it during the meeting, it gets everybody at the same level of information. And so this is the process by which we make big decisions in the company. It has to be based on a logical, well-written narrative. There's another way in which large enterprises often fail in decision-making, and it hinders their ability to innovate. As a veteran of these government organizations I mentioned, I saw it firsthand. And that is a failure to recognize that there are really 2 basic kinds of decisions. One kind of decision, if you make it, it's very hard, if not impossible, to unmake it. Jeff calls these a one-way door. I think of it, I'm an electrical engineer, I think of it as a diode. Current can only flow in one direction. But the point is this, that after you make the decision, you might not be able to take it back, or it's going to be really difficult, maybe possibly to your reputation, or financially expensive to take it back. But it turns out that the vast majority of decisions in any large enterprise are not one-way doors. They are something else. They are decisions that if you make them and they turn out to be failures, you can undo them. And those kinds of decisions have to be made fast, or you're just wasting time. Because if you've got all this information and you pull it together to make a decision that you could have just undone if it didn't work, it's a big waste of time, and it slows down large enterprises, including government agencies. So I encourage you that when you're thinking about a decision, ask yourself, is it reversible? And don't think about personal embarrassment. I mean, unfortunately, it's human nature. No one wants to fail. No one wants to be wrong. But it should be recognized in every government agency and every large enterprise that failure is part of innovation. And so if someone is trying to innovate and happens to fail, he shouldn't be punished for that. He should be rewarded with trying to think of new innovations to try out and to actually experiment with. And likewise with this decision-making process, why take a long time to make a decision that if it turns out to fail, that you could have just undone it and stopped doing it? And we've made some of those failures along the way. We had a telephone for a while. I don't know if you knew this, but we had a mobile phone that Amazon made back in 2014, and it didn't last a year. It was kind of a complicated device, and it had a lot of cool innovations in it, but it just didn't work out. And We actually took like $170 million write-down just to deal with getting rid of it. And obviously it wasn't a commercial success, so we could call that clearly a commercial failure. But the teams that worked on that failure, that phone, went on to develop the Echo products that are now quite successful for our customers. And these Echo products, working with Alexa, the digital assistant voice controlled, these products were born out of the learnings of the failure. And so even sometimes when you fail, you get something good out of it. And so again, you won't know until you try. And those sorts of things are worth trying. One last note, and my time is winding down. You have a very hard job, right? You all do. You have to respond to forces that a private enterprise doesn't have to. I understand politics, I understand elections, I understand public expectations, public criticism. It's hard for you. I understand that very much. But I do encourage you to try out some of these ideas. Some of them are quite simple to try internally, and no one will ever know the difference unless you succeed at them, and hopefully that you will. Things to try internally would be to have small teams address new challenges or opportunities. Think of a startup within your enterprise. And it wouldn't happen to be in the same sort of org structure. I mean, everybody has these org trees. But try to pull people from other areas and pull together small teams that could act like a startup, at least initially, when working on a new thought or project. Second, try that 6-page narrative in meeting. What's the harm? The only harm, perhaps, is the person who would prefer to write in bullet points and not write in a narrative. They may suffer a little bit in advance, simply because it takes longer to write a narrative than it does to write out bullet points. But at the same time, the meeting will be so much more efficient, and you'll be able to consider your ideas better. The harder things to try are true experimentation, truly being willing to fail. And some government agencies may have the impression that if they fail at something, that's the end of it. They just cannot fail. Well, how can you be human and not fail? And if you're going to fail anyway because you're human, you might as well fail in the goal of innovation and experimentation. And I think it's explainable, especially if there's not a large monetary commitment to it. I mean, citizens will understand if you say that, look, we've done something and we tried this and it didn't quite work out, we're going to continue to work on it. That's acceptable. If you say, well, we had to write down $170 million, that's less acceptable. And so that's why dividing decision-making into those type 1 and type 2 decisions is so important, because the type 1 decisions, if you fail at, you're going to face some heavy criticism. The type 2 decisions that you can just sort of undo and walk back, not so much. So anyway, good luck to all of you. Thank you so much for your attention, and I wish you all the best.